Well, that's a great question. And in terms of our experience, we've had a fair amount of experience of both of those, partnering well and partnering poorly. And I think that there are just tremendous opportunities for mutual edification and strengthening through churches that are very different than one another, pursuing intentional relationship. Now, that could be inner city versus suburban. You know, increasingly, you can have two churches that are right next door, but one of them is a very wealthy church and one of them is a very poor church. And a strong partnership between those two churches is great because they're going to be able to reach pockets of their community that are different. And if they're doing it together, that's going to make it stronger. In terms of ethnic makeup, you know, churches that are majority white churches partnering with churches that are majority African American and majority Latino. I think all of those kind of, let's cross demographic lines to form deep relationship with Christian congregations who are different than us, has so much opportunity to strengthen one another's ministries and to learn from each other, because the reality is we're all reading the same Bible, but we're reading it through a lens of different experiences. So we're finding things that are true from God's word and that are true about Jesus that are different from one another so we can strengthen each other. I think the most healthy partnerships, to answer your question, Todd, start with relationship. They start with relationship and they build trust where people know each other and love each other, and then they grow from relationship and trust to practical ministry partnership. So the ones that we've had most healthy relationships with have started like that. We've brought people from our church, not just me, but like a group of people representing our congregation, and go do events together. Or they brought people from their church down to the south side and done events. And I'm not talking about like outreach events so much. We've done some of those service projects and so on, but just like worship, fellowship times to build relationship and to build trust. And so that then, when the inevitable differences between cultures of the congregations create conflict flashpoints that we don't think are going to happen at the front end, but then they always do, there will be a resilience to the relationship because it's based on really knowing each other. Some of the potential conflict areas or problems between, let's just say we're talking about like a majority middle class suburban congregation or an inner city congregation that has a lot of poverty. There are going to be different strengths in those two congregations. For example, the suburban, more middle class church probably has stronger families because in the inner city, their families have just been so ravaged. So they're going to have an opportunity to bring marriage mentors, those kinds of things. They probably just have a lot of more stability, stuff like a lot of teaching and modeling throughout their lives on how to do Christian stewardship of finances well, and so on. The inner city poor congregation probably in the course of its everyday life practices hospitality and faith and risk-taking faith and generosity in ways that feel very normal to them but might feel very abnormal to the average suburban congregation. Those are talking about strengths. And talking about weaknesses, I think those are going to be very different too. The inner city church will be late to everything usually. That would be one example, at least my church. We experience time differently. I don't know what it is. And so that would be one of those things. We plan later, we change plans right before. There's just cultural differences like that. And actually, I'm talking about those things as weaknesses. Actually, I'm not even sure they are weaknesses, but they're often perceived as weaknesses. And so when you get into partnership, a lot of things that will inevitably happen is that suburban middle class church will by definition have more financial resources, but it can come to move very quickly towards financial partnership. And if there's not the relationship there, it can become an exploitative relationship on both ends, actually. Inner city church is just using a suburban church for the money, and the suburban church is just using the inner city church to have, our picture of look at how much we care about the inner city, and there's not depth of relationship and mutual love and sacrifice. And it also often, with money comes unconscious desire to control. And we just had to learn that when people come, when the conversation starts, we just are so thankful for what you're doing and want to come alongside and partner. And then 2 months later, it's like, we just really think you should do this differently. We say, thank you for your interest. If you decide you want to come alongside and partner, that's okay. But money becomes a tool to try and shape the vision, when it's really the people that are in the inner city that are going to understand best what needs to happen there. And sometimes it may be that that suburban church actually could help mentor some of the leaders in the inner city on certain things they could be better at, but there needs to be a long track record of relationship before that trust is going to be in place. So lots of potential, lots of promise for mutual strengthening, but I'd say the key piece of advice is start with relationship and then go from there and recognize that the ministry partnerships will probably be a little more frustrating and a little slower than what you plan on the front end, but if you'll persevere because there's depth of relationship, then good things can happen.
Thank you. So part of what I'm hearing you is both urban and suburban can learn from each other.
Oh, yes.
And encourage and help grow each other.
That's right.
Each other. The other, help me with this part. You talk about relationship, and I get that. It's kind of like I haven't dated. I've been married to Cindy for 34 years plus 4 years of dating, so I haven't dated forever. If you said, Ty, go out and date now, I go, how?
Yeah, I don't know either.
And so how does this idea of a relationship start? There's not an app for it, sure.
I don't know. There's a lot of apps out there now. I think one of the things that's just been really helpful is, two things actually. Two things that have been really helpful. Planning some joint events that have the only goal as let's worship and fellowship together. Usually with food. Jesus always ate with people. And if both people bring food, then you get different food too. So it's like, all right, we already like your culture now. So things like that where you're fellowshipping, doing potlucks together, and just letting people share their stories is one of the great things, as opposed to just starting with a project. But I would say also, if there's projects that each church is already doing, it's great to come alongside just to serve. So, for example, in the summer, we do tons of block parties and block parties, and we call it Adventure Club. It's like Vacation Bible School, but it's in the apartment complex, and we're doing like 2 or 3 every week all summer long. Those are real easy endpoints for people to just come, jump in and serve and build relationship while we're doing it. And we've had churches that are in a suburban context, but would have no idea how to reach a suburban middle-class neighborhood, but they've got some big outreach event that they're doing, and we'll come serve. And so now it's not like we're trying to partner to create a new initiative. We're just jumping into what each other's already doing, but we're building relationship as we're serving alongside one another. So those are 2 things that have been helpful. And then coaching people going into those events. Don't let it stop at the event. Exchange phone numbers with somebody. When it really gets serious is when people are eating with each other's feet under each other's dinner tables in each other's houses. But inner city people often feel very uncomfortable about that. Just because they practice radical hospitality towards one another, but they just feel insecure about that. So just recognizing that reality, inviting people to your house, or do what Jesus did all the time, which is invite yourself to their house for dinner and offer to bring food. Zacchaeus, you come down. I'm going to your house today. So if you invite yourself over, I probably won't turn you down.
All right. So one of the questions is, what tips do you have for being able to stay in the game for the long haul of pouring yourself out for the brokenhearted? Because there is cost. You made that when you were talking. There is cost. You do get weary. Yeah. How do you keep from just checking out?
That's such a great question, and it's one that's on my heart lately. The 2 words in the Bible that have been standing out to me most for the last probably 6 months are the word steadfast love. It's actually one word in Hebrew, hesed. But steadfast love. Because what we need from God and what our neighbors and the nations need from us is not little spurts of passionate love, but steadfast love over the course of years and decades, even when it's hard. I mentioned during the sermon earlier, my buddy Josh, who came to know Christ when he was 6, and now he's 21. That's often what discipling indigenous leadership in an inner city congregation looks like. But I could tell you I could tell you some really encouraging stories of God's grace in somebody's life like Josh, but I could tell you a lot of stories of people that lived with me for a long period of time that were doing well for many years, and after 5 years or whatever, the post-traumatic stress that they have from growing up in poverty blew up and the relationship fell apart and they left the church mad. Or really weird stuff where people that I poured into for years all of a sudden leave and start going around telling everybody the pastor's demon-possessed, which kind of hurts my feelings when that happened. So did you notice how I said when that happens, not when that happened one time? Good grief. Yeah. So there's just really discouraging stuff that happens along the way. And so I think a few things that I would say. One, motivation. This is why I was really harping on, if we're fueled by guilt for our privilege or something like that, that just doesn't work. But if what fuels me is Jesus has been so gracious to me, I just want to pour out that generosity and grace, that will sustain us. Second thing that I would say is, it's like everything in the Christian life, it's an overflow of abiding in Christ. One of the idols we actually have to be aware of is the idol of getting identity out of ministry. I want to worship Jesus. I don't want to get my identity out of ministry stuff that I do. And so whenever I get exhausted, I just need to pull back to say, like, intimacy with Jesus is number one priority. And the third piece, which is related to that, is we really need a community of grace that supports each other. One of the best things that my community does for me is tell me to take time off, tell me to say no to opportunities, and just send me to rest and recover and be with Jesus. And if I don't do that, I will often just kind of like press to a point of exhaustion and then get sick and take myself out for a month. And so I think having a group of people that we're not trying to impress each other, we're ready to love each other when we look like a mess, is one of the key things. And just the last thing that I'll mention is, for me, I think it's really sustaining. You know, Hebrews talks about remembering the leaders who went before us. Hebrews 13:6 or 7, I think that's 7. And Hebrews 12, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And there's certain heroes of people that I know, like John Perkins. Do you guys know John Perkins? Okay, if you don't know, everybody go buy the book, Let Justice Roll Down by John Perkins. People like John Perkins or William Carey or William Wilberforce, for that matter, who persevered through intense pain for long periods of time and got to reap the harvest decades later, that inspire me and keep me motivated. So there's a few things.
Thank you. What you're telling me is that we need to have authentic believers, brothers and sisters, walking arm in arm together.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of a combined question from a couple different ones. How do you care for the marginalized without just giving them handouts or making them dependent upon you? And then there was kind of a slash, are these toxic charity issues? The book Toxic Charity, if you haven't gotten it, it's a really good book. Many people kind of throw around.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's such an important question and such a hard one. First thing I would make, so I want to make a distinction. The charity that is toxic, the problem is not that we're helping people who don't deserve it. Because the reality is, depending on what we mean by this, either everybody deserves it or nobody deserves it. Everybody's made in the image of God and deserves to be treated with dignity. On the other hand, we're all sinners. Like, a pretty high percentage of my problems are at least partially my fault. I don't know about you, right? And that's true. Like, one of the things about urban poverty in America is that urban poverty trains people in a poverty mentality that then they make decisions that continue to recapitulate the problem. And so we have to recognize that and be patient with it. So the problem is with the wrong kind of help, the toxic kind of help, is not helping people that don't deserve it or something like that. The problem is helping people in a way that isn't actually helpful. So Luke 6 talks about, Jesus says, be kind to the ungrateful and the evil, for that's how your Father treated you. So in terms of what isn't actually helpful, I found that if somebody comes to us in a crisis, I err on the sides of let's just help. You're in a crisis, let's help. But we want this to be the beginning of a relationship. Hopefully we already have a relationship, which is the case a lot of the time because we're embedded in the community. But if somebody comes with a crisis, let's just help, let's just help. But then if there's coming back again needing more help, we need to transition to a situation in which if you're wanting help financially or in some way repeatedly, we want to walk with you, but we're going to ask you to open yourself up not just to money, but to help, advice, counsel, accountability with what are we doing with this. So for example, one of the guys that came to know Christ in the last couple of months, I won't share his name, but he knocked, I wish evangelism was always this easy. I was sitting in my car getting ready to go into our staff meeting, and this guy walks by outside our community center and like knocks on my window and asks me to roll down the window. And I was like, I'm either about to share the gospel with this guy or I'm about to get mugged. I'm not sure what's happening. Either way, we're going to fellowship with Jesus in this moment. But it was the former. and he just started saying, I need somebody to pray with me. I've never met this person. Although I found out later that another church member met him and had a conversation with him and had to leave, but prayed, God, send somebody else to share the gospel with him because I don't have time right now. And so I got to be the answer to that prayer. But he said, I'm thinking about killing myself. And he just started going through this long list. My girlfriend has a restraining order on me because we got into a fight. She's about to have my daughter. I can't see my son anymore. When we got into a fight, I lost all of my ID. I have no social security card. I have no birth certificate. I have no state ID. I want to work to provide for my family, but I can't get a job because I don't have any of these things. I don't know where to start, which is really hard to do, by the way, if you lose everything at once. Although I learned how subsequently, if you want to know. Just an overwhelming number of needs. At this moment, the right response is not to say, hey, listen, I don't want to help you in a way that hurts. Let's get you in a job training program. Like, he's just in a crisis. He needs help. We're going to need to spend lots of hours driving this guy around, helping him get food, doing whatever's necessary. But as the relationship continues, growing accountability so that now he's been coming to church every week. He's in a small group. We're trying to help him get into a recovery program. He's confessed faith in Jesus. We actually have helped him find a job that he's working at in their intermeeting period, to where we're trying to ask folks to make decisions that can lead to lasting change. And as they're making those decisions, we keep walking with them. And if they don't want to make those decisions, really respecting their dignity and autonomy to go that way. And just say, hey, if you don't want to go this direction, that's fine. We love you. We're not going to do any more financial help until you're willing to do this. The second thing that I'd say is that we've tried to focus our attention on issues that are addressing, we put a high percentage of our effort into addressing chronic issues rather than the repeated crisis symptoms of those issues. So that's why stuff like tutoring kids so that their third grade reading scores don't land them in jail, a couple decades from now, is high priority for us. Stuff like getting high quality primary care physicians for children so they don't have diabetes and come needing $1,000 of medical bills in 10 years has been high priority.
Okay. I think also, as I hear, part of the toxic charities I've read, the challenge to me as a suburban guy is not to do the feel good and coming back to U-Haul up and drop off stuff and check the box and save.
Yeah.
And I think in many cases I read that book, that was a challenge for me. We want to take and say, we don't want to be harmful. And that almost allows us the reason to check out completely. And
that's right.
That's the proper interpretation of that book.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. And that just reminded me of another story. So this last week, it's one of the challenges, as we're discipling our kids of how to love our neighbors, the thing where you're driving by and there's somebody with a sign on the corner? Well, that's like every corner in my neighborhood all the time. So it's always a pressing issue of what's the right way to respond. And often, we also teach a Bible study in that person's apartment complex or whatever, so we can have a relationship through other ways. But just this last week, we were driving by, and there was a woman who I've seen at the corner of 59th and Penn a few different times, and she's always holding a sign, and she's always just weeping the whole time she's standing there. I just felt like the Lord touched my heart to go pull over and go talk to her. And so I did that. I had two of my kids with me, and we prayed for her before we got out. And I went and talked to her for a second, and the situation is a mess. Her boyfriend left her, and now she's in this rental property where she's trying to pay. She's got Social Security disability income pending, but she has no income right now. He had not been paying the utilities, so she owes like $1,000 to keep her utilities on, in addition to trying to get the rent paid. And she's been trying to find a job, but can't find a job. And so she's just staying there in the corner trying to get enough money to keep the lights on and keep rent. Like, she's just in total survival mode. And as I talked to her, I knew that if this is not sustainable, and if I pull from our church's Mercy Fund and other churches that we know to get the $1,000 off to pay these utilities, there's just a really high likelihood she's going to get evicted next month anyway. And then that $1,000 is not available to help her get into another place or whatever the next step would be. But if I come to her trying to kind of counsel towards long-term solution when she's in survival mode, that was just not going to work. She can't get there. And so what we did was just pray for her. The kid, she was standing at a CVS, so able to take the kids in and just get a few groceries for her, some things that she said that she could use at the house right now, just to have a love and a point of need in this moment, which starts a relationship of trust. And then to say, just tell her, I'm a pastor. If you want to talk about long-term solutions, sit down with a caseworker and pray together about what would be a good option. Here's the phone number. So the ball's kind of in her court now. But start with radical generosity at the point of need, but then look for long-term relationship. And long-term relationship, I think, is when helping helps instead of helping hurts.
What you're telling us is there's no cut and dried answer. It's not easy. And when you were preaching this morning, what I heard was, this is hard, this is complicated, and we just have to lean in.
That's right.
Trust the Holy Spirit to lead. So we're going to keep stepping into some of this. Some of this may be more justice causes, a little bit more just systemic things. This particular question says, what do we do that causes oppression or suffering for the least? And what are things that are unintentionally harming people? In other words, good-natured people just create difficulty.
Yeah. It's such a great question. It's such a hard one to answer. I think there's one thing that we just need to keep in mind is, first of all, there's just so much going on in the world which it isn't a gray area. It's just like explicit cruelty and oppression. So there's a lot of that out there all the time. People in the community go to work and then don't get paid. Just wage theft happens all the time. Landlords who are using and abusing people happens all the time. So there's just a lot of explicit oppression. Now, as I think about this group, those of us here, this is a room full of people that love Jesus and would never do any of those things. I think the thing that probably we need to be more conscious of is a lot of times we get from the Bible a sense that my first circle of responsibility, in terms of concentric circles of responsibility, who am I to love, starts with my family. And that's true. What does Jesus say? Whoever doesn't provide for his own household is worse than an unbeliever. So, Paul said that actually. Jesus said something kind of like that. The reference is escaping me. So we're called to take responsibility for caring for our family, but often we're making those decisions about what do we do with our family in a way that we're just not thinking about an ecosystem of how our decisions affect everybody else. And then once you do start thinking about the ecosystem, the answer is still not simple with what to do about it. So let's just talk about it in relation to education. Everybody here, like me, wants the best possible education for your kids, right? Does anybody not want the best possible education for your kids? We all want that. And we should want that, and we should pursue that. But there's a reality of I'm a person who went to a private Christian school. I'll tell you that story in a second. But I went to a private Christian school, and now my two eldest kids go to a private Christian school. We homeschooled them for a little while too. So I don't want any of this to sound like what it might sound like if I didn't give that preface and if I wasn't clearing my throat for another 2 minutes here. But the reality is, if you ask, when did the private Christian school movement take off? And when did the homeschool movement take off and grow? And then you ask, when did the schools become integrated? The correlation is disturbing. So that doesn't mean that any of us are saying, I want my kids to only go to school with privileged white kids or something like that. It just means, sometimes we're not conscious of the ways in which our desire to pursue the best for our families is maintaining systems of segregation that the Christian, African American, and Latino families in my neighborhood have saying, I wish I had other options, but I don't. And so for those things, I think the thing to do about it is not to feel guilty. We have a model of incarnational ministry that we're saying we want to live in the community, we want our kids to fellowship in the community, we want to go to work and to go play and go to the park and go to the library in our neighborhood. We believe strongly in that, but ultimately when our kids became school age, it's if I'm going to do everything I can to get my kids the best education possible, and all my neighbors are saying, please find a way for me to get my kids out of the school. So I'm not going to put my kids in that school. But I can't just stop there. And so for myself, the Lord was just pressing me, I felt like, with the two questions. One, the schools that most of the kids in your neighborhood are going to be in, how can you make those as good as possible? How can you be invested in that? And so that's stuff like sending our kids our adults into the schools to be teachers. It's stuff like adopting their classes. We've done some advocacy work to address some of the complicated policy issues that our state is working with right now, because we've just had so many of our people that have been in that world for decades that we kind of have an insider view of some of that. But also it's where this question came from of like, I think homeschool is beautiful, and I think Christian school is beautiful, but if we've got these beautiful homeschool groups and Christian school groups, how do we find a way to share that with kids that could never get access to it? I remember speaking at a church about this 5 years ago, and the church, like the whole church homeschooled their kids, and they were talking to me about this and just praying or whatever, and then a couple years later, I saw them some of the moms from that group in a park, and they came up to me and they were so excited, and they said, a couple of our church members moved into this apartment complex across the street from our church, and there was all these refugee kids, and we started a homeschool cooperative where we were homeschooling our kids, but we were inviting inner city kids to come homeschool with us, and I was like, that's it. How do I share this beautiful thing with others? Part of what I mentioned earlier, the vision of St. Paul's Community School that's trying to provide access to Christian school. I think the reason why that was so heavy on my heart is because when my dad came to know Jesus, that didn't immediately change our family's financial situation. So I grew up in poverty in Texas, in a low-income, inner-city, ethnically diverse community with struggling schools. But there was a really, really good Christian prep school in our area that had a superintendent that loved Jesus and that met our family and said, if you'll come work as janitors, we'll waive the tuition so you can come to this school. So I grew up sweeping and mopping stairs and wiping whiteboards in the school that I went to, but it was an excellent school that allowed me to get the academic preparation, then to get a full ride to the university and so on academically. That never would have happened for me if somebody hadn't just said, I'm just going to make a sacrifice, not just to care for my kids well, but to figure out how do I share that with as many people as possible that would not have access. And so I think those are the kinds of hard conversations we need to have, which is not about like I'm trying to oppress somebody. It's just about sometimes when I'm taking care of my own kids, I'm not thinking about how it affects the broader systems, including lots of Christian kids that come from poverty. So how do I, while I'm caring for my kids, care? If I love my neighbor as myself, I got to care about the education of my neighbor's kids as much as the education of my own kids, I think. And so how do I try to be more conscious of that reality, and then to take small steps of obedience as God leads towards helping it be better for my neighbors as well.
You know, a couple things I appreciate about your answer. One is, if you get to know John Mark for any length of time, he gets in depth. Generally speaking, they're not cut and dried answers. They're systemic issues, and it's complex. And I think sometimes as believers, or maybe as Americans now, we just want a 30-second soundbite from whatever channel you listen to. And then we want to go vote that way. But the other thing is, I was listening to your story about the superintendent that stepped in, and when you the trajectory, and you won't say this because you're too humble, but the impact that guy had that led you to an education at OU, led you on to additional doctorate work and stuff, that led you to a pastorate here in the city. I mean, there are dots that in heaven will be connected that we may or may not sometimes put into place right now.
Right now we've got 8 inner city ministry leaders, many of whom are coming from the inner city, people of color and so on, who are getting their master's degrees in theology, which I'm able to teach about half of their courses locally because of the academic background that I had. And now those people are they're starting and leading organizations in our metro and low-income communities that never would have happened if the superintendent hadn't let me come be a janitor at his school. Is it simple? No, that school almost went bankrupt and they fired their superintendent because he was helping too many people. It's complicated. But he made a difference for a period of time.
And I think that's the thing I hope it is complicated, it is messy. You stood up there and said, we've made plenty of mistakes, but we keep pressing on. And I think as a body and as Christians, we should be ready for that. One of these questions, are government programs to help the poor, and I'm having some, to help the poor a hindrance, and should we partner with them?
Well, it's such a great question, and it's pressing, I think, on a lot of our minds. I think the answer is some of them are helpful and some of them aren't, and some of them are hurtful. So it really just depends. And part of the other, Todd told you that I don't have simple answers for stuff, which is another way of saying I have a long-winded, circuitous response to every question. One of our church members, when he comes up to me, says, he'll preface his questions like, hey, could you, in 2 sentences or less, tell me? And I'll just say no. I couldn't. The PhD cured me of that ability. And a lot of government programs are really helpful to 40% of the population and really harmful to 40% of the population and neutral to 20. So it's just so complicated. Okay. So I think what we've tried to do is find ways to partner redemptively. One of the good things about it is even when the systems are bad, that doesn't mean you can't partner redemptively. Think about the moment when John the Baptist, what's this, Luke chapter 3? Is it 4? I'm going to go look. John the Baptist was preaching, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And everybody's coming to him saying, what do we do? You remember this passage? If you have 2 tunics, give one to your neighbor with no tunic. And then the Pharisee and the tax collector come to him. The Roman soldier and the tax collector come to him and say, what should we do? Everybody, here's a zealot Jewish prophet. Everybody there thinks he's going to say, first thing you got to do is quit your job because you work for Babylon. Right? That's what everybody thinks he's going to say. That the Roman tax system really was exploitative. And the Roman military was in many ways actively oppressing God's people at this time period. But what John the Baptist does not say is go shake the dust off your feet and leave that system. And what he says is essentially walk in righteousness within that broken system. Right? Be content with your wages. Don't take more than you're supposed to. And so I think what we've tried to do is 2 things. On one hand, there are broken, imperfect systems in our community that there's a lot of things we disagree with about them, and yet they're not going anywhere. They're going to be here, and they're going to have a massive impact on human flourishing for thousands of people in our neighborhood anyway. So we said, let's just live within those systems of salt and light to the best of our ability. So public school system would be one of those systems. The public health system would be one of those systems. We have strong relationship with project housing, which is very complicated, and yet we're working with project housing, government funded, to create programming that's supportive for people in the community and so on. So the systems aren't perfect, but they're here, and they're having a huge impact on people. Let's work within them, while simultaneously recognizing a lot of times the things that are going to be able to have a much deeper and longer term impact are going to be things that we can organize and creatively put together ourselves, not within that system as well. So that's why for us it's both and. Both, we're trying to saturate the public school system with salt and light, and we're trying to start a private school that inner city kids can get to. Both, we're trying to saturate the medical system with nurses and doctors and board members who can influence it for good in an inner city environment, and we're starting private clinics to help people. So that's been our approach.
Okay. Hey, John Mark, what would be your advice to people who feel just overwhelmed by the amount of issues and don't know where to start or what to do? And I think I understand. I mean, you can almost get frozen by the amount of things coming at you. What would you say to that person?
I've been there. Let's start a support group. But I think the key thing is come back, recenter on Jesus and community, and then start with people instead of issues. Every time we've gotten into an issue, education, immigration, mass incarceration, whatever it is, we haven't started with the issue. We've started with people. And as we get involved in people's lives and there's increasing numbers of people affected by this thing, then that is one of the ways that we discern that God's calling us into that issue. But we just start with the people around us and get involved with them and let the issues grow out of it. And then I think a lot of times we're just circling back as a group. I mean, we've got a group of about 14 core leaders in our church that meets for 3.5 hours twice a month to pray and talk about this stuff, like what's the directions we're going, what do we say yes to, what do we say no to? Because it's easy to get spread out so wide that we just exhaust ourselves and do everything poorly. And my personality does that. And so it's really good to have some like engineer, accountant, cautious personalities. So you can almost like script the conversation before you go into it. It's like, hey, I found these needs and I feel like expending all of our resources to try and fix this right now. And then this person says, well, that sounds great, but what about this? And this person says, and then we pray together for a while, and as a group come out, we feel like God's calling us to do this one thing, but not those three. So it's really important to walk in community. If we get out of community and we're trying to go solve the problems of the world as our own, that's just a dangerous place to be. And it's really good for people with my personality to remember there is only one Messiah, and his name isn't John Mark, right? So I cannot fix everything. I've just got to trust in Jesus and stay in community to help me discern which are the things I should be addressing.
So what you're also telling me is that in your core group of people...
Could you just come with me everywhere and do this after I give a long response? Then you can give the 2-sentence answer.
So for those who don't know, Cindy's paragraphs, Todd's bullet points. Cindy and John Mark hit it off real well. Go figure. I love John Mark. But what I'm also hearing is I hear you talk about these different people, the accountants and engineers come together. As God gave different skills, different personalities. It's the body, the hands, the eyes, the feet, all coming together to fulfill his calling and learn each other. The other thing, as I think through what you were saying too, is an individual, because I'm paralyzed and overwhelmed, doesn't mean I get to sit on the sideline. Just because God hasn't given me the spirit of hospitality doesn't mean I don't get to be hospitable. I'm not called to be hospitable. We're trying to say in the Go Therefore group is God has given you a passion and desire on your particular heart. It may be different than mine, John Mark's, whatever, but just fulfill that particular passion and calling he's given you in that respect.
Yes, and one thing that you said that I'll follow up on. So there's just this exhaustion factor. If you get involved in ministries of mercy, of meeting people's needs, compassion fatigue is a thing. Exhaustion is a thing. And it takes a lot of that discernment and community to figure out, because sometimes the answer is I need to rest and retreat in the presence of the Lord. I need to learn the discipline of rest. But at other times, I think of the story when John the Baptist was just killed. The disciples had just gotten back from a mission Jesus sent them on, and the text says they were so busy that they hadn't even ate or drank. So just intense levels of physical and emotional exhaustion. Jesus takes the disciples for a retreat. They go across the lake to get alone by themselves to rest and pray. There's Jesus showing us it's okay to retreat, to rest and pray. But the problem is when they get there, they see a crowd that has run around the lake and is ready to meet them there. And what Jesus does not do is in that moment say, sorry, can't help you. We need to retreat. In that moment, it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. He spent the whole day healing them. So sometimes we need to pull back and rest, but other times it's like in the exhaustion, when Jesus sends us somebody to love, actually the experience of loving that person now that my resources are gone and I have to depend only on the resources of Jesus is where my sin and my selfishness and my self-reliance get exposed, and I find the re-energizing grace of Christ. So sometimes actually just pressing through the exhaustion and dependence on Jesus has been the answer.
Okay, thank you. So here's what are some of the resources that have been helpful for you in understanding of how to show mercy and loving your neighbor? And you can't say the Bible because that's a given.
Okay.
Well, you can't.
In addition to the Bible.
In addition to the Bible.
So many things over the years. I think there's a set of books that are really helpful for the inner city church in which everybody's poor and they're trying to figure out how do we survive this. And there's a certain set of books that are more for like our church has a fair amount of resources and we're trying to figure out how to steward this well in a way that honors Jesus and takes care of people. And there's some that kind of work for both. On the latter, actually Tim Keller's book, Ministries of Mercy, is really helpful. That has a lot of practical counsel about how to start things well and build programs that will have deep impact on the community without exhausting everybody by constantly trying to start new things. So Ministries of Mercy is a great book by Tim Keller. Before he planted Redeemer, Tim Keller spent years helping upper middle class white Presbyterian congregations that didn't have any mercy ministries start their first mercy ministries. So he had a lot of experience in that area, and this book comes out of that experience. One of the best books on partnership is a book called Linking Arms, Linking Lives, which is it's the subtitle is something about urban-suburban partnership, but really it's just about how do you have churches, it starts with churches, but then says churches and nonprofits and businesses filled with Christian people from very different backgrounds work together well, kind of like the first question. That was written by 4 authors. I think it was Wayne Gordon, John Perkins, Ron Sider, and I forget the 4th. So that's a great book. I mentioned John Perkins earlier, his book, Let Justice Roll Down, and all the other books that he's written, Making Neighborhoods Whole, and others are really great books on how to do this well. Robert, I'm blanking on his name right now. This may come back to me in a minute.
Yeah, if it comes back to you, great. If not, you guys want, if John Martin, he can let me know, and then you guys can find me one day.
Yeah.
We'll get that stuff to you. It was actually Lincoln Arms and Lincoln Lives when we went to listen to you one night that you referred me to, and it was extremely helpful. And I understand this concept of relationship first, because if you're type A, which some people might say I might be, and if you tend to just want to move the needle, you forget the relationship piece, and that's been a challenge for me to I can remember. All right, we'll keep stepping into some of these questions. Again, if you have other questions, bring them to Caitlin. It looks like she's got some there too. One of the questions earlier was talking about system issues and stuff like that. This is going to jump into some system issues. We can't invite you here and talk about your ministry in the South Side without bumping into the discussion of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular person says, and I'm going to possibly misread some of the handwriting, but as a proponent of DACA, what has hindered the immigrant from seeking legal status or citizenship? And I think that's the best I can read that.
As a proponent of DACA.
What has hindered, basically, as a proponent of DACA, what has hindered the immigrant from seeking legal status and citizenship?
Yeah, great question. So before diving into this question, I'll just say, especially when we start talking about systemic issues that may or may not be related to the big fights that we have on Facebook and on cable news, it's just so important to start with grace. Just grace. Because these issues are so complicated, I think we need so much more grace and patience to listen to people and work through the conversation together. And my goodness, Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. I just want to say, like, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been feeling like one of the major battles as a pastor is saying, like, let's be formed by the Bible, not by Twitter rants, not by Facebook rants, not by cable news. Now, in my congregation, I got a lot of, like, urban inner city millennials who are in danger of being formed by MSNBC and CNN. I would guess that's probably not the temptation here. So there may be some other networks that could come to mind, that might approach this from a different angle of fear of the immigrant or whatever the case may be. So I just want to say, like, this is part of those are some of the conflict issues that come up when you start partnering, why you need deep relationships. So having said that, I'll just say a little bit about my experience and try to speak to that question. I've been living in communities that have a high percentage of first generation and second generation immigrants from Mexico for my whole life, actually, but especially for the last 17 years. And having that experience of life before all these issues kind of blew up in the media just so dramatically shaped my perspective, because I knew that like 90% of my neighbors, literally 90%, were people who, whether they came legally or whether they came without any documentation, came because they were fleeing situations of extreme poverty or violence. And then they came to the U.S. Seeking to be able to feed their kids, seeking work, and seeking to be able to educate their kids. My experience confirms anecdotally what the research has otherwise incontrovertibly established, which is that undocumented immigrants are far less likely to break a U.S. law than a U.S. citizen is, for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that they'll get deported. So they're not criminal activity. I have never had anything stolen from my house or my car vandalized or something I have had those things happen a lot, but never by an immigrant. It was never by an immigrant. As a matter of fact, on the contrary, I really have had my house broken into and windows smashed and car vandalized and all this stuff a lot in our community. It's usually by usually by an angry white kid. I don't know why. I'm just saying the facts, you know. But immigrant neighbors literally do things like, since I'm the absent-minded professor, call me in the middle of the night and say, hey, you left your car door open again. Could you come shut the door? You know, they're watching out for me all the time. So I just want to clear the air of that's the reality of the experience. That's the reality of my experience and of most of the people that are living in South Oklahoma City. DACA, the question asked about, some of you may not be familiar with, refers to Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was an executive order passed by President Obama that deferred action doesn't mean a pathway to legal status or citizenship. It just means we're not going to deport you. We're deferring the action of deporting you. Deferred action for childhood arrivals means people that were brought to the United States as kids can then apply for DACA, which means they get a social security number, a work permit, a driver's license, and as long as they don't break any laws, they can stay and work. There was no pathway to legal status or pathway to citizenship. When the DACA program came out, it was really scary. It was a hard decision for lots of kids because if you sign up for that, most of the people who signed up for that have a sibling who is a U.S. citizen because they were born here and have at least one parent who is undocumented, which means now I'm going on record with the government that I was brought here without documentation, which means if they decide, the next president could just axe DACA and then could come for my family and deport my parents and deport me, and now my little siblings are left here by themselves. So that was a scary situation. Some of them decided not to sign up for DACA because they were afraid of what was going to happen to their family. But tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually did sign up for DACA, which was a risky thing to do, but Alejandro Munoz, who's one of the young leaders in our church, signed up for DACA because he just said, I refuse to get a fake social security number. I have no home to return to in Mexico, but I want to obey the law. I'm trying to follow Jesus. So he went and signed up for it. When President Trump came into office, he did cut the DACA program, but actually he called on Congress to come up with a permanent solution for those kids. And they have repeatedly failed to do that. I was kind of proud of some of our Oklahoma Republicans that when all this stuff was heating up in 2016, I felt compelled personally to move into public advocacy about this issue. And we ended up leading there was a public prayer pilgrimage from Santa Fe South Elementary School to Frontline Church downtown that we helped organize. That was like a 7-mile walk in solidarity with immigrants trying to raise awareness about this issue. We did various press conferences and different things. And before long, some of our Republican representatives were calling us and saying, hey, we hear your heart, we agree. Help us understand what's the best policy thing to do to affect immigrants in our community. So a couple of our conservative leaders were the first Republicans in the nation to say, hey, we need to protect the DACA kids. But when the program got cut, Congress, mostly because Congress there was bipartisan support for protect the DACA kids, but they couldn't agree on what needs to go into that package. And of course, it's does the border wall go into this package? What happens to the parents? Those kinds of debates. And so we're at a stalemate right now, and it's a huge existential crisis for thousands of my neighbors who signed up for DACA, and now their DACA is cycling off. The government has their names, and now all of a sudden they don't have any protected status. They're about to lose their jobs, and they're saying, what do we do? It's a pastoral issue for people in our church. The answer to the question of what blocks people from applying for legal status is that there is no pathway to legal status for them. For the parents, there's usually no pathway to legal status. The reality is there has been for decades a mismatch between the demand for migrant labor in the U.S. and the number of visas that are provided. So over half of our total agricultural labor in the United States is undocumented immigrant labor. Because it's really hard. I mean, that migrant labor stuff is really hard. Even very poor citizens, researchers just found, don't want that job. But undocumented immigrants will do it, and there's economic motivations to keep them undocumented, actually. The same is true in other sectors like construction and other things. So people came here desperate to escape violence and to provide for their families, and there was never a pathway to legal status for them. And then after they've been here, of course, there's no pathway either. So most of the debates are mostly about, should we create a new pathway to legal status, or should we leave a situation where they just need to be deported and there is no pathway?
And again, complex, but you started off by saying grace in the conversation, being willing to listen. And I would add, I mean, we're all created in God's image. And regardless of where you fall politically or whatever, that's got to be the first part of the thought. Anecdotally, you talk about people taking advantage of those who are undocumented. So many of you all know I used to have a construction company that built cell phone towers. One of my competitors, I came to find out because his employee came to work for me, had two groups of employees. The white guys, when they traveled, they stayed in the hotel. And then the Latinos, they stayed in the warehouse. And what could they do? You want to object? Yeah. They had no rights, per se. And we see that, in Scripture talking about protecting those four different groups. Yeah. The widows, the orphans, the poor, and the ignorant.
There have been several studies taught in different cities like San Diego that have a lot of migrant labor, or states like Arizona that are trying to research how much of this kind of exploitation is there. And it's really hard because people aren't like wearing a badge that says I'm an undocumented immigrant. But what they've consistently found is that about 1/3 of undocumented immigrants have experienced wage exploitation at a level that approaches slavery. Consistently, about 1/3. And obviously you don't get yourself in that situation unless you're desperate. So I think that's part of the realities. And I would say also, I usually would not talk about this in a situation like this by myself. It's just that everybody else had jobs at church today that I was trying to get to come with me. But normally I only come if I've got 2 or 3 immigrants who are telling their personal stories. Because what I found is if I come into a conversation like this and start with statistics, and even if I'm telling the stories and Bible verses or whatever, it's just really hard to have the conversation. But so many times I've seen that people who come in on polarly opposite sides of this issue politically, when I've come with my friends and they just tell their life story, and how when I was 14 I found out that I wasn't a U.S. citizen. And then I applied for DACA because I wanted to do what's right. And now I'm going to college, and I'm teaching Bible studies at Christ Community Church and trying to mentor in the community, but my DACA is about to expire, and I don't know what I'm going to do. First of all, we all start crying together and say, we might be divided politically, but we're with Alejandro. We're with him. And now we can start praying and saying, given all the principles of justice and equity in the Bible, what's the best way forward as a nation? And how can the church, without becoming partisan, step into the moral conversation, because it's a moral issue before it's a political issue?
Okay, another question. We got, I want to take advantage of the last bit of time we have, because you've been a great resource as it's challenged us. This person asks, what kind of responses do you get from the schools, because you guys have invested there, and how many have allowed church involvement? In other words, bringing your faith to the public school. What have you seen?
Well, in our case, basically, the schools are so under-resourced that they're desperate for help wherever it can come from. So I will say some of the churches, our partner churches like the Well Church and Western Hills churches that we work with closely in South Oklahoma City, have done a lot more church-school partnership than we have. We've been more focused on neighborhood apartment complex type stuff. But when we mostly step into and follow the leadership of what they're already doing, it's just amazing. It's overwhelming, not only that there's a wide open door for ministry, but that there's a desperate need. My friend Jace Kirk is one of the best at this. He works with FaithWorks in the inner city. He's on the OKCPS school board, and he works with Santa Fe South Charter Schools. But he has been working in the school system for about 17 years now, and calling churches and Christians to come help in that. And during that time, he's done a poll of kids, where over and over and over, he's asked hundreds and hundreds of these kids, how many caring adults do you know with whom you can have a hard conversation about something going on in your life? And the kids, he said, are not like bitter. They're usually like saying, maybe I could talk to my uncle about this, or that kind of a thing. But he gives the percentages. I didn't bring them with me, of like, this many people say they have 3 or more. This many people say they have 2. This many people have 1. But the majority, more than half, say we have 0 caring adults that we feel like we can talk to if we have something hard gone in their lives. So the need for mentors, if it's just like, we don't have to come to an agenda of like, let us teach a Bible study 3rd hour. If we just come with like, hey, what are your needs at the school? How can we serve? Do you need people to help read? Do you need people to help with special events? Then usually the schools are like, yes. And that's going to immediately form relationships with people that are hungry to be mentored, in which you can share the gospel and start discipling people. So I just found it's an overwhelmingly open door.
You know, along those lines, Caitlin sat down early on in her job, and I'll get some of the details butchered, but you get close enough picture, and ask the Yukon person what it is you need. And you'd be amazed at the answers, and I'm not going to be able to repeat them very well, but if God has put that on your heart, and perhaps it's not in the inner city, perhaps it's just across the street at our schools here. Our schools are struggling. Schools across the state and the nation are struggling. Ask Caitlin. She and I, we talked. My hope and prayer for our church, and I don't, other than the fact you let me have the microphone, is that God will burden the lay people to say, I want to pick this up in this particular school, and I want to invest here to bring kingdom to that school.
Yeah.
Next school. Fill in the blank. I don't care what the name is. It can't be Caitlin doing it. She can give guidance and leadership, but the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So that's the hope and prayer in that respect.
And what's really encouraging to me about what Caitlin's doing and others in your church is this reality. So right now, in places like South Oklahoma City, we're experiencing the beginning of this term people call gentrification, which is basically like middle-class people coming back to a historically poorer area and doing development, which in many ways is positive. It does have some negative effects, including often displacing people who have lived there for a long period of time and all their networks of relationship are there. But what goes with that is the suburbanization of poverty. So I think what we can expect is over the next 20 years, lots and lots and lots, to the order of tens of thousands of poor people that right now live in concentrated pockets of poverty like South Oklahoma City and Northeast Oklahoma City are going to be moving to Edmond, Norman, Yukon, all over the place. And one of the huge questions I think that the body of Christ in our metro area needs to face is, what are the churches in those suburban communities that are equipped to love those poor people well? And so we just sent out a church plant team 2 years ago that planted a church in Norman to focus almost exclusively on people living in poverty, because there were no churches doing that really there. I mean, there were a few that are doing some good work actually that they're partnering, but not very many. And there was like 50,000 people below the poverty line, or not below the poverty line, but in a free and reduced price lunch category for schools, which is 180% of the poverty line. So it's just so urgent, I think, to plant different kinds of churches in what have been seen as wealthy suburban communities, but also for churches that are in there to try and catch up with and or get ahead of this reality of the suburbanization of poverty. Say, we want to be a church for the people that are coming here, not just the church for the people that already look like us.
Thanks for that encouragement. This person asked, how can a person help sponsor a student at St. Paul's? By the way, this was never meant to be an advertisement. That's not John Mark's heart.
Just lobbing it right up there.
I asked him to come and share with, because I said I've had the joy of just sitting down and talking with him, what your church is doing, and the apartment ministries and this and that. And you guys have heard the story about stepping into the school piece. But this person wants to know about helping to sponsor, and then also, how can we pray for, of all things, Christ Community Church at CCC. One of his staff members sent me a note saying, hey, I hear you're at CCC. And I was like, well, there's probably a good chance. I did happen to go to his church that weekend.
Either way.
So how can we pray for you guys and about the sponsorship, please?
Well, I'll answer the prayer one first and then come back to sponsorship. So to pray for the church, there's a lot of things. We talk about all the time indigenous leadership, indigenous leadership, indigenous leadership. We long for people from the community to be transformed by a relationship with Jesus and then become the leaders in the community. And so we're committed to that. But the reality is, like, if people are coming from multiple generations of poverty and family pain, it's just a long, hard road to disciple people to be at that point. So pray. I mean, I could just start mentioning Isaiah, Infinity, Cameron. Like, I could just start mentioning names of dozens of young people right now that we're praying are going to be Indigenous leaders within the next few years. That just pray for their protection, for their perseverance. That would be the biggest thing. The other is, we have this issue of, like, we are a church for the community, and we were a tiny, like, 6 years into this thing, there was like 50 people showing up on Sunday, and we were a church of the community. It's long, slow, grueling work. And over the last few years, more people from the outside who are Christian people that want to help have, like, moved into the community and started coming to church to help. But it also puts on this pressure of, like, as that's happening, the church is becoming more white and more middle class, which means when the next person from the community comes to church, it might be a little harder for them to feel like it's their church. That also means that we had a budget in the surplus for the first time ever this year. We had no idea what to do in the meeting. So those change dynamics, what it really means is reconciliation is happening. But it's just painful. Reconciliation is not easy. It's a slow, painful business. So you can just pray for God's grace in those change dynamics. For the school, we didn't want to open enrollment until we felt confident it was financially sustainable. And so it is now to that point that we have enough sponsors to start this year. No, not for all of the kids, but we've got a lot of them still 8 months out, or time has passed, 5 months out. So we are now actively recruiting enrollment, but we're a little bit late in the game on that. A lot of people have already made school decisions. So just pray that God will lead us to the right family. We have hundreds of relationships in the neighborhood, but we're starting pre-K through first grade, and most of our relationships are with kids or with kids that are a little bit older than that. So for some, it may just be kind of like first cold contact with people. So just pray that God will touch the hearts of the parents, the families, the kids, to the right kind of first couple of classes for this group. We're going to add a new class each year, by the way, to go up through at least 8th grade is the plan, Lord willing. So pray for that student recruitment process that we're kind of catching up on to get ready for August. As far as being a student sponsor, it's a really cool program. Abby Anderson, who's the director of advancement for the school, has set it all up, and she understands it all much better than I do. But it's a beautiful model where we're wanting to, what she's trying to do is invite sponsors to sponsor. It's actually not sponsoring a student, I keep saying that, but sponsoring a seat. So in a class of 16 people, we want 16 seat sponsors. So there's not just a one-to-one, like Compassion International type model, because there's so much closeness of proximity that could become an exploitative relationship one way or the other. But we do want to have close relational connection. So each class is trying to get 16 sponsors to sponsor 16 seats. And then those sponsors, they don't have to, but they're invited and strongly encouraged to come several times during the year to visit the class, meet the kids, interact with the families, and build relationships that could be really mutually strengthening. So you can do, I think a full sponsorship for a kid is $7,000 for a year. And then there are, like, you could do a half sponsorship or a day sponsor, which is cheaper. And then we're also looking for, like, small groups, Sunday school classes, community groups, that kind of thing, that want to together sponsor a kid. So those are all how to do it, and the best way is to get in contact with Abby Anderson, which you could share my contact information with somebody, and there's a website, I think it's spcs.org, I should know that.
You can get a hold of me, and I don't know what it is, but I do know it, maybe it's spss.org, but if not, get a hold of me. And
I'm obviously not the detail guy when it comes to this.
We got to wrap it up here in just a second. You guys have stayed. I appreciate your willingness to just share and step into some harder conversations, and that takes vulnerability on your part to be willing to do that. And,
it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me, friends.
Thank you for that. The other thing I want to do, and I forgot to mention this, so we've been talking with the staff, Kate and I, there's a heart to kind of press into some of these harder issues, but maybe not necessarily the 12 o'clock hour, the church hour, but on the evening, and just step into some of these things. And so we've turned to something called Covenant Conversations, where life's just not neatly packaged. It's the cultural issues, and what does the Bible have to say about some of these things that we're going through. Be on the lookout in your bulletin down the road. I think the latter part of April 28th, if I remember correctly, is what we're hoping to do that and start off with that initially. And then we hope to actually bring in what I would again call, and they don't like the term, experts, to be able to share, perhaps it's John Mark's team, some other teams, to just share some of these things and give perspective. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm just going to close this, and I'll tell you what, let's give you a hand.
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for what you're doing in each one of our hearts. And as we prayed this morning, let us not leave as unchanged people, but mold and shape us and penetrate our hearts by the work of your Holy Spirit. We pray that you would bless Christ Community Church and John Mark's leadership team, and that you would give them just the stamina to continue on with what you have called them to do, to be faithful stewards in all the things and to proclaim your name. And we ask this in Jesus' name.